This video was brought to you by Brilliant. In most of the developed world, it's long been accepted as a truism that people start off left-wing when they're young and gradually get more right-wing as they get older. In English-speaking countries like the UK and the US, young people are actually becoming more left-wing in their youth and staying left-wing for longer. However, in much of Europe, the reverse seems to be happening. Across the EU, right-wing parties are performing conspicuously well with young people. When we were doing research for our Finland Elections Explainer, which came out on Tuesday, we noticed that, according to polling, the nationalist Finns party was the most popular party among 18 to 29-year-olds, with 26% of the vote, 8 points ahead of the second-placed Greens. It's not just Finland either. Young people seem pretty keen on right-wing parties in places like France, Italy and Sweden, to name just a few. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at how young Europeans have shifted to the right, how this compares to countries like the US and the UK, and try our best to figure out why this might be happening. Let's start by looking at the places where young Europeans are moving right. As we mentioned in the intro, Finland's neighbour Sweden has shown signs of this phenomenon too. In 2022, the right-wing Sweden Democrats won 22% of voters aged 18 to 21, up from 12% in 2018. It's a similar story in Italy, where the ruling right-wing Fratelli d'Italia are remarkably popular with young people. A Techni poll from just before last year's election found that Meloni's party were the most popular party among 18 to 21-year-olds, with 23% support, closely followed by another right-wing party, Lega, on 22%. In Germany, at the 2021 Saxony-Anhalt regional elections, the far-right AfD won a plurality of voters in every age bracket from 18 to 44. While the AfD performed pretty badly among young people at the federal elections, the most popular party for the first-time voters were actually the economically right-wing, pro-business FDP. In France, young people generally preferred Le Pen to Macron, who fared best with pensioners and over 50s. Now, it's important not to overstate this. In France, for example, while Le Pen did better than Macron, their preferred candidate was still Jean-Luc Mélenchon, a left-wing firebrand who now heads up the left-wing NUPES coalition. Similarly, while the FDP did well amongst first-time voters in Germany, they were only a percentage point ahead of the Greens. It's also worth saying that this isn't an entirely new phenomenon. In the 2010s, many Central European right-wing parties became remarkably popular with young people and first-time voters. Poland's Law and Justice Party was, by far and away, the most popular choice for first-time voters in 2014, garnering roughly a third of the vote. In Hungary, which has been led by Orban's right-wing Fidesz party for over a decade, polling from 2015 found that a plurality of students wanted to vote for Jobbik, a political party even further right than Fidesz. In Slovakia's 2016 elections, 24% of first-time voters voted for the People's Party, a far-right group that won just 8% of the vote across Slovakia as a whole. Nonetheless, this was previously mostly a Central European phenomenon, and the trend has definitely accelerated in recent years. It's also difficult to square with what's happening in Anglophone countries like the UK, the US, and even Australia, where young people are getting more and more left-wing. In both the US and UK, for example, millennials are actually getting more left-wing as time goes on. Before the 2019 general election in the UK, YouGov gave Labour a 43-point lead among voters aged 18 to 24, and a 24-point lead amongst voters aged 25 to 34, and estimated that the chance of someone voting Conservative in 2019 increased by about 9 points with every 10 years of age. Young Australians also deserted Scott Morrison's coalition party at last year's elections, and young Americans were significantly more likely to vote Democrat at last year's midterms, especially young women. In most political commentary, this phenomenon is considered relatively unsurprising. After all, Gen Z and millennials are pretty socially liberal and likely to be poorer than their parents. So why would they vote for small c conservatives with antiquated social views offering more of the same? So what's going on here? Why are young Europeans shifting right, unlike their Anglo counterparts? Well, no one knows for sure, but there are three possible explanations. First, Europeans are far more moralistic than their UK and American counterparts, and far more likely to view poverty as a choice. Young Europeans are actually more conservative in this respect than previous generations. OECD polling from 2018 found that 18 to 29-year-olds across Europe were more likely than older generations to attribute poverty to, quote, laziness or lack of willpower. This isn't the same in the UK or the US, where the discourse around racial and social justice has made young people more, not less, favourable to wealth redistribution. Second, young Europeans are generally more anti-immigration. While young Europeans are more likely to think that immigration is a good thing than older generations, they strongly prefer EU over non-EU immigration, and are about as likely as previous generations to support, quote, additional measures to fight illegal immigration. In fact, until last year, young Europeans put immigration as the most important problem in the EU, ahead of the environment. Last year, the environment and immigration were joint top as the most important problem, with 30% of young Europeans putting each in their top three. Again, this is a stark contrast to the US and the UK. In the US, only 20% of Americans under the age of 35 were in favour of Trump's wall on the Mexican border. In the UK, young people are far more pro-immigration than their parents, and immigration hasn't been top of their concerns since 2015. Third, it might have something to do with Europe's political systems. In part, because they're representative rather than majoritarian, Europe's political systems are now more pluralistic than the US and the UK. In other words, Europeans usually have multiple parties to choose from, whereas in the US or the UK, there are only two real options. The right-wing parties that young Europeans like usually have an anti-establishment bend, and it might just be that young people think the current system isn't working, so vote for the most anti-establishment party out there. In Europe, that might be a new right-wing startup, but in the UK or the US, there's not really a viable anti-establishment option, so young Brits and Americans just have to settle for Labour or the Democrats. So that's three possible reasons young European voters are more right-wing than their Anglophone counterparts. Obviously, it's possible we've missed another possible reason, so if you can think of any more, please leave a comment down below. But with elections taking place across Europe all the time, there were 3 last weekend alone, it's worth seeing how young voters change over the next weeks, days and even minutes. But while we're waiting, it only takes a few minutes every day to massively improve your skills and safeguard your career against artificial intelligence by investing in your human intelligence, and that's where Brilliant.org comes in. Brilliant.org is the best way to learn maths and computer science in a fun and interactive way. Brilliant has thousands of lessons, from foundational and advanced maths to AI, data science, neural networks, decision-making and more, with new lessons added monthly. That logical decision-making course is super interesting too, using principles from maths and science to help aid how you reach your own decisions. Not naming names, but maybe some politicians need a Brilliant account. Anyway, you can try everything Brilliant has to offer, free for a full 30 days, by clicking the link in the description. Plus, the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support and for watching TLDR.